This last segment explores the Hindu use of idols and other kinds of images in their worship. When I first started discussing this, I tiptoed around the subject like a Westerner who was afraid of offending Indians, and I refused to use the word idols. In a religious context in the West, and in the context of Christianity, idols has a negative connotation because idolatry, worship of idols, is by definition a sin in the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Indians, however, call them idols. It doesn't have a bad connotation there. They'll call it the statue or the deity or the image or the idol. It's all the same to them, so I just use the word that way now. Diana Eck is a scholar at Harvard University, and she's the leader of something which you can Google, find out what it is. It's called the Pluralism Project. Basically a project to help encourage friendly, informative dialogue and mutual understanding between people of different religions. She was raised in a mainline or liberal Christian environment in the Midwest and traveled to India and basically fell in love with the Hindu tradition and participated in all the worship herself, and is someone who has famously written about and who has kind of defended and explained it to the West. This resulted in her 1981 book called Darshan, Seeing the Divine Image in India. She points out that in India, images of deities are just everywhere, not just temples and homes, but even on the street and in shops and so on. She worries that if we don't understand what's going on, that this will cause us a kind of xenophobia, a kind of fear and loathing of foreign things that we don't understand. She comments on the reaction of most early modern era Europeans and Americans to this phenomenon. So she's talking about people in the 16, 17, and 1800s here. She describes the reaction as combined fascination and repugnance. The fascination comes from the fact that our culture is not like this. We do have some religious images, particularly in Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but they don't play the role in any Western culture that they do in India. The repugnance comes from the fact that Judaism, Christianity, and also Islam teach that idolatry is a sin. It's also viewed in the Bible as stemming from human ignorance. One popular definition of idolatry is that it is worshiping some created thing rather than the creator. The idea that a lot of Westerners have then is that only God should be worshipped. To worship anything else is giving what should be given to God alone to something else. The Hebrew prophets in the Jewish Bible, in what Christians call the Old Testament, ridicule idolatry as idiotically bowing down to sticks and stones, worshiping things that can't see or hear or do anything, that have to be carried around. Greek philosophy, also, which influenced mainstream Christianity, tends to look down on worship of idols. They view sensory perception as kind of shallow and less than fully human and just not as important, and they hold that the ultimate reality, the things that really matter and the things that really matter for religion, are seen or beheld with the mind alone. In other words, Greek philosophers have been kind of offended at the sensory nature of all this. And use of idols is a sensory practice. It's based on how they look. And you burn incense, you light fire, you give flowers and garlands of flowers. You do all kinds of sensory things that involve sight and sound and smells. You might ring a bell, for instance. That's what the reactions used to be, maybe up until early 20th century. I find now that most common Westerners' reactions are something completely different. They just don't have a biblical mindset, a traditional Jewish and Christian mindset about these sorts of things. To the contrary, they're sensory people themselves, and they find all this rather exciting. They find it colorful, interesting, and wonderful. They don't have that reaction like the Greek philosophers of thinking that there's something shallow and even bad about the material world. And they don't really get why God would be against this sort of thing. That's the common view now among religious and non-religious Westerners. Eck points out that in the, quote, Western religions, that is, in Abrahamic monotheism, that is, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that the word is greater than the image. They all use some visual arts or other, but what they focus on are teachings and the study of books and even the production and decoration of books. Of course, as I mentioned, some Christians do use idols themselves. They don't call them that. Greek Orthodox call them icons. Roman Catholics just call them statues. Well, some Christians are like that, and other Christians, particularly some Protestants, are aniconic. They're against the use of images, particularly humanistic images, in worship. They don't necessarily hold that you can't picture Jesus or the saints and so on, or even God the Father, but they don't think that Christian worship should involve bowing down to pictures, paintings, statues, and so on. Back to Eck. How does she kind of defend Hindu idolatry? Well, one thing she does is she points out that the term idolatry is an outsider's term. That's true. The term idol has been happily adopted by Hindus, but idolatry is kind of by definition of sin, and generally they don't call it that at all. Another thing she says is that these images are not regarded as merely stones or wood or whatever it's made from. And thirdly, she says, basically, we don't look at things this way. That is, we don't look at things the way that the missionaries of the 19th century viewed them, where this is a foolish and evil practice, and it's backwards, and it's heathenism, it's paganism. Of course, if you're a traditional Muslim or Jew or Christian, none of this is going to move you an inch from your position. Not really relevant that idolatry is an outsider's term. For you, the issue is whether God approves of this stuff or not. Of course, they're not mere stones. No idol worshiper thinks they're only worshiping stones. Of course, they're always trying to worship what the stone represents. They think that the god or the goddess is a reality other than the stone. They recognize that if they, kick the statue in the shins, it's not going to jump down off the stand and run after them. And for certain Hindu festivals, they actually make a bunch of idols just for the festival, many times out of easily destructible materials. And then at the end of the festival, they burn them, or they dump them in the river and just let them disintegrate, and so on. And they don't think that they've killed off the deities by doing that. Just they've made the image, they've blessed it in official ways, and endowed it with the deities in question. And then once it's sort of decommissioned, well, then it's not really special anymore. They just throw it away in some cases. And her claim that we, the good people, the broad-minded, religious, pluralist, sort of liberal-minded, cosmopolitan, 21st century educated people, well, of course they don't look at things in the way that they're viewed in the Bible or in the way that Protestant missionaries 100 years ago viewed them, but that's not going to be relevant to you if your religion says that this practice is wrong, if it says that God disapproves of this, that he doesn't want to be worshipped with idols. So there isn't really any interreligious dialogue here, or really any relevant interreligious arguments. But Eck is helpful in our understanding this practice. She points out that there are two main attitudes that Hindu worshippers have to the images they use. One view is that these are merely devices to help us focus concentration. Some would say without a sensory form, how can God be meditated upon? They urge that it's hard to meditate just without anything to stare at, and it's much easier to meditate about a specific deity with an image of that deity to use, whether it's representational or not. Sometimes they take the view that use of images is merely a stage that's to be grown beyond. That's the view that's taken in the Advaita Vedanta school, famously by Sankara. Advaita Vedanta is not at all against image worship. Their view is that the less wise need that, and it will help them to progress. But they think that the wise leave it aside and learn how to realize that Atman is Brahman without any of these tools. The more popular view, though, and the one that Eck focuses on, is that the image, once it's commissioned, once it's installed properly in the temple, becomes, quote, an embodiment of the divine, end quote. This is the belief that the god is somehow literally present within the statue or within the picture after it's consecrated, after it's put into service in some official way. They view this as a special divine grace that God reaches out to the devotee in this way. The idea is that God or the gods know that we're sensory, and so they come down into sensory form and inhabit that form so that we can access them there. X says these images aren't thought to stand between the devotee and God. Rather, they facilitate access. Each one is a form of the Supreme Lord, she says. And so Hindus, when they worship in this way, will very often stare intently at the idol. And I've been told that sometimes they feel it staring back at them. And in that, they believe that they have experienced Krishna, Vishnu, Kali, or whomever. That finishes our quick survey of Hinduism then. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next up, Buddhism.